Welcome to the introduction to graded assignment 6. This one's called Orbit Report. I'm going to talk about the core concepts covered by this assignment, take a look at the big picture so you know what it is that you're building, and we'll do an overview of the different tasks and take a look at the starter code. And then I'll just talk about some common issues and tips and kind of recap some things to watch out for, and then give you a few reminders at the end. This assignment covers chapters 28 through 31. So you have concepts like modern JavaScript syntax and several things from React, like components, props, JSX syntax, mapping over an array of objects to produce some JSX, and state variables and the useState hook. In my lectures, I have introduced the useEffect hook, but you do not need that for this assignment. You can save that for your capstone project. As for the previous chapters, you are using pretty much everything you've learned up until this point. This is where it all comes together. You will not have to write any unit tests and you won't be fetching any JSON. But other than that, this is pretty much an accumulation of everything that you've learned. So let's look at what you're building. You are going to build a basic page that displays a list of satellites. You will have a banner component. That's this part up here with the title and these instructions. And you'll create 4 buttons that will filter the satellites by orbit type. So if you click on low orbit, it should show just the satellites with low orbit, same with medium or high orbit. And then if you click this button, it should just display all of them again. And then the table itself, which is down here, you'll have a header row, have 1 satellite on each row below that, and then 4 columns of information for each satellite. So its name, what its type is, the launch date, and the status. And then the styling is actually optional. If you choose not to implement the CSS that they provide, it won't look quite like this, but I will show you what that looks like in a bit. So let's do an overview of all of the tasks and take a look at the starter code. This is a link to the instructions. They are right here. And if you go to the main page here, you can see the list of all of the different sections. So in the introduction, they just go over what I just showed you about what it is that you're building. And they also show you these screenshots. And one of the things that they note here for you is that the screenshots are showing localhost 3000. That's because we used to use a different tool for creating React applications, but we use Vite now, which will actually be at port 5173. So don't worry about the fact that the screenshots still show 3000. Yours will be 5173. So this is what it looks like when you first start it up. And then later when you've completed it, it should look like this. Or if you have not applied CSS, it'll look like this. And you can have either one of these will be acceptable. So in task 1, they give you the link to the starter code repository, and they remind you that you need to fork and enable GitHub Actions. You need to clone it to your local machine and then install the dependencies with npm install. And then you should use npm start to serve the application to the browser. For some of your React applications you've done for LaunchCode, you used the command npm run dev. This particular assignment is configured a little differently, so you'll want to use npm start. And again, that's port 5173. And if you start it up and you go to the browser and it looks like this, then everything is working as intended and you can move forward. Talk about the file structure a little bit. We'll look at the starter code here. The package.json file, as always, will have the dependencies needed. So when you run npm install, it will put all of those in place. You'll end up with the node modules folder up here. You'll have a package lock.json file here, and then you'll be ready to go. So make sure you don't modify anything other than these files. You want app.jsx here, which is the primary parent component for the application. And then there are different component files in this source/components folder right here. You're going to be modifying buttons and table, and you'll also be adding a new component called banner. There is optionally a quick fix that you might need to make in styling.css, which is the file right here in that same folder. I will cover that when we get to it. The test directory has an autograder file that's right up here. And you can run tests at any time with the command npm test. It's essentially going to be testing the 3 different components that you're putting in place: banner and buttons and table. So you can run those at any time. When you get done at the end, you should have all 9 tests passing. So again, if we look here at the instructions, they tell you about, the starter code link and npm install, npm start, and then they just kind of do an overview of the files you're going to be working in the most. And again, what this should look like when you run it after you've installed the dependencies. Task 2 is about banner.jsx. Let me talk about that a little bit. You're going to be creating a new component for this that isn't already in the starter code. So if we look here in components, you'll just see buttons, the satellite data you'll be using, the styling CSS you'll be using, and table. But banner needs to be a new component here. You're going to add a header element for the title and a P element for the instructions, and that's it. And you should have these 2 pieces of information showing in the browser at the very top above the placeholder button and all of that. Make sure you place an instance of the new component in app.jsx, or you will not see this quite yet. So they cover that down here, and they show you how to add that right above the buttons in the table in the app component. So for task 3, you're going to update app.jsx. There are kind of 4 parts to this. I want to talk about them a little bit, and I'll go back and forth between the instructions and my slide here. The first thing to note is that these 4 things that you're doing in task 3 actually just provide functionality for future tasks. You're not going to see any changes in the browser just yet. You'll have to wait until you get to tasks 4 and 5 to start seeing more changes on the page. But these are important. You have several things you need to put in place. The first one is to create a state variable called sat that is going to hold all of the satellites that are being displayed. And that data is actually going to come from this file here, sat data, where we have all of these objects. Each holds a different satellite and has all this different information about it: ID, name, type, launch date, orbit type, and operational. And so over in app.jsx, you will need to create that sat variable here that's actually going to use the imported sat data, and you'll set that as the initial value, and you'll have the satellites ready to be used. So the code looks like this, right? You set up, use usate hook to set up the state variable and its setter, and pass in the sat data that you're importing to set that initial value. And they provide that for you right here. The second part here is to create a second variable. Now they call this display sats. It doesn't actually represent satellites, it represents orbit types. So I'm going to give you some different code to use. I recommend that you change the name of this. Call it orbit types instead of display sats, so that it actually represents the type of orbits. And also, because down here in this third part, they give you another variable called display sets that does actually represent satellites. And this will prevent confusion so that you don't have 2 different things, 2 different types of data using the exact same name. So so I recommend calling this orbit types, because as you can see here, what's really happening is it's going through the satellite data and mapping over it, but it's returning the orbit type for each one. And then they explain here what's happening with the set method, where you're actually creating a set of unique values, because the satellites are going to have 3 different types of orbits. And they mention that here: low, medium, and high. And you're going to have a button for each one of these. And if you just use map, you'll end up with 10 different buttons, and they'd be duplicates. Several of them would say low or medium or high. The set here will allow you to make them unique and only have the 3. And then, of course, the spread operator here sets them into a new array for you, and then you can use that. So if you call it orbit types, it will represent orbit types. You should end up with an array of these 3 strings: low, medium, and high. So here's the code where I've renamed it here, and you can see I've just called it orbit types instead. And I'm going to be consistent with that as we go to actually use this data. I'm going to continue to use this name to distinguish between that and the display sets that they use here in the filter by type method. So speaking of filter by type, let's talk about that. This is a function that filters the list of satellite objects based on their type, so that when you click a button, it can go and actually find just the satellites that are that orbit type, either low, medium, or high. So here's the code for this. They provide this entire function for you. You filter by type, you pass in whichever type it is, and then it will go through and create a new array called display sats of just the ones that actually match that orbit type. And that's what this filter method is doing for you here. Then once you've done that, you can actually add the 3 props of the 3 things you created to the buttons component so that you can pass it down to that component as a child. The filter by type function that you created here, and then the setter function for the state variable you created called setSat. And then, of course, orbit types array instead of using display sats. This is the one where I changed the name. You want to pass that array down that says low, medium, or high so that the buttons component can create 3 buttons representing those 3 different orbit types. They also want you to add a prop to the table component, and that's going to be the actual state variable sat that's holding the array of all of the satellites. And that's what it starts out as. But of course, being a state variable, you're going to be able to update it. And that's where that filtering comes in. And sometimes it's going to hold just the low ones, and sometimes it'll hold just the high ones. And then when you use the 4th button in the component, you can set it back to hold all of them again. So that needs to be available to the table so that the table can display just the satellites that you want to. So that's going to look something like this. And this is exactly the same as the code they provide for you right here, except I have renamed this 3rd one to orbit types, since that's the name I chose to use to distinguish between that and the display sats that are set here. Okay, so that's the end of task 3. Let's look at task 4. This one's all about buttons.jsx. So you're going to come into this and see the starter code that looks like this with just a placeholder button and a second button that says all orbits. You'll notice that they already provide for you the 3 props, and they're destructuring them here from the props object so that you have access to each 3 of the 3 of them individually. And of course, they have display sets here, but if you change the name to orbit types, you want to change it here as well. So I am going to cover that here. Yes. So you can see the way I've done it here. I've changed it to orbit types right there. Then they talk about how you are going to update the first button. And this has thrown students for a loop in the past where they say, wait, aren't we supposed to have 3 buttons? And yes, you're going to replace that 1 button with 3 buttons. So it might initially have, just this 1 placeholder button, but you can get rid of this entire thing and replace it with some JSX that you're generating by mapping over the orbit types to produce a button for each one. So that'll be your first 3 buttons. And then while you're doing that, they tell you to use 2 callbacks here for ID and set. There's a couple things I want to say about that. First of all, a callback is actually a function, not just the parameters. So this might throw you for a little bit of a loop. Also, the way that map works, the first parameter that you can use for the map function is the actual element of the array that you're mapping over. So this would be your first one. And then the second one would be providing an index, not an ID. So this is a little bit of a misnomer to say ID here, because the way map works, that second parameter is actually an index. So I've represented that in my code here. You can see I called it orbit type, so I'm mapping over orbit types. And then I also changed the name of the parameter here from sat to type, because it doesn't represent a satellite, it represents an orbit type. And then I changed the name of this from ID to index because that actually is what it represents, whatever index the current element is at in this array. And then the rest here is the same. I just made sure to use the same variable names that I created up here as parameters, type and index everywhere that's needed. Otherwise, it's the exact same code that they have here. For the second button, which is now, of course, the fourth button, that's actually separate. You don't include that with your mapping because it's just meant to hold all of the possible satellites. So if you look at the code here, they've got this button in place and you can keep this, but you need to add to it because right now it's not wired up. It's not functional. You need to actually put an event handler on this so that it will take all of the possible satellites and set the state variable. It's a lot of alliteration. Set the state variable to hold all of the satellites again if you have filtered it before and it was only holding, a filtered list of them. So that's pretty much it for task 4. You won't actually have these buttons doing anything just yet because the table has not been done. That's the next task, but you should see it on the page. It should look like this. So if you've gotten this far and the buttons actually appear here, then you are halfway there. And once you get the table done, you'll be able to test their functionality and make sure that your handlers are doing what they're supposed to do. Okay. So the next task is to build the table. They already have some of the code here. So let's take a look at that. They have the table, they have the header section and the body section. And then inside the head and the body, they've got a single row here and a single row here for now, just as a placeholder. Something you might want to do here is add a little bit of indenting to help you see the hierarchy of this. So like I might do like this, and I might take this a little bit like this. And that way you can see the hierarchy of the head section, the body section, each of the rows, and then the cells inside the rows. But because they just have like a single cell here for the header row and a single cell here for a single row in the body, you'll have to replace this. And you actually want 4 columns for this header row so that it has name, type of satellite, launch date, and status. Then you want to map over the sat data, which has already been provided to you as a prop right here. It's been destructured from the props object. So you can access sat, which is that array of satellites, and then replace this with a bunch of JSX with repeated rows that have, all 4 columns accounted for. So for every satellite, you'll have, the name, the type of satellite, the launch date, and then you'll have this text here. And I'm going to talk about this in just a second, how you create this text. One of the things that they recommend is to use, and they call it an ID here, where and again, they're using that term callback to refer to the parameters instead of the entire callback function, but that's okay. But you don't really need to use the index here that's provided by map. Instead, you can actually use the ID of the satellite because it does have an ID. If you look at the sat data here in satdata.jsx, you can see that every single one of them has an ID, and those would be unique. So you can, it's considered best practice that if your data has an ID, use the ID. It's coming from a database somewhere, in real practice where it's guaranteed to be unique. So it's considered a better practice to do that than to use the index that's provided by map. So I'm going to recommend that you actually just use the ID from the satellite rather than using an index. And then you really will have only one parameter. You'll just have what they're calling data that represents one satellite, right? And so you can use whatever name you want there. But map over it, access a satellite, and then set all 4 of the TD tags that are needed for that row. And then when you're mapping over it, you'll be able to produce that over and over again for every single satellite. And then the last one is the status. So this 4th column has these 2 different strings, inactive and active. But that's not actually what's in the data. You can see that what they have is an operational property here, and it says true or false. So you'll need to add some conditional logic to make sure that what's displayed on the page is actually the text active or inactive based on whether operational is true or false. So at this point, you should have your banner, your buttons, and your table. And when you click on those buttons, you should see different lists of satellites rendered. So make sure you do a reality check and make sure all 4 of those are working. Once you've done that, you're pretty much done, except for step 6, which is the optional styling. So this is very simple. There are 3 components that will require you to import styling.css from the components folder. And then there's one place in buttons where they tell you to add a class name. But this is all optional. So if you do this, if you import it into those 3 and you add that class to the div and buttons, you should see something that looks like this. However, there's a slight issue with it because the header right here isn't going to look quite right. It's going to have some white around the edges. So here's how you fix it. You can actually go into styling.css and you'll note that there's 2 different places. One's at the top and one's at the bottom where they have H1 instead of header, and you can just change it. So here's the CSS file. At the very top, you see H1 here. Just change that to header, just like that. And now here at the bottom, same thing, just change that H1 to a header, and then it will look exactly like this and you'll be in good shape. The very last thing to do is to run the autograder tests. So just run npm tests and make sure all 9 tests are passing. You can see that they're testing the 3 different components that you worked on, banner, buttons, and table. And it's not testing anything from app specifically, but the fact is buttons and table will not work properly unless all of the things you did in task 3 are in place properly. So make one last commit and push everything to GitHub, and then you can notify your TA and submit your link on Canvas, and you should be good to go. So before I do this, let me actually do a reality check for you here. I'll actually do a demonstration and show you what this looks like. So I'm going to switch to my solution branch here. Make sure this is up and running. So npm start. All right, and if I open this at port 5173, we see that we have everything looking exactly how it's supposed to. And if I click on these buttons, you see that it filters and shows each one of these as they're supposed to be. And then if I click the last button, all orbits, it just provides all of the satellites that were available to begin with. And you do see, inactive and active over here instead of, true or false. Okay, so if you look at this in the element inspector, you can make good use of your tools here and go through and check that out. If you have the React Dev tools installed, and I highly recommend them, you can also check this out and see the hierarchy where banner, buttons, and table all exist here inside the app component. And you can see, that the props have been passed down, right? And all that satellite data is coming down. And here you can check the props and see, oh yeah, I've got that filter by type function. I've got the 3 orbit types, low, medium, and high. And I've got setSat, which is also a function that is provided by that state variable with the use state hook. So this is, helpful tools to make sure that you do have in place what you actually expect to have in place. Okay, so let's talk about just some common things to think about. Make sure you're reading the instructions thoroughly. I did an overview of everything, but you want to read everything very thoroughly. Familiarize yourself with the starter code so that you know where it is you're putting your code and what's what. Make frequent git commits. At minimum, make a commit every time you complete a task. But you can make them more often than that if you want to, especially when you're working on task 3, which has several different parts. Whenever you would like, use temporary console log statements to test values or debug. And then You can, as I just showed you, use browser dev tools and React dev tools to check and make sure that your data is working behind the scenes there the way that you expect it to. And then run your tests with npm test and make sure you clean up your code. If you have extraneous comments or code you didn't end up using, you want to check your indenting and your line spacing and your semicolons, make it nice and clean so it'll be easy for your IA to look over it when they are grading it. Make sure your app is running correctly before you start adding any code in task 2. So that's really the main thing to take away from task 1. Actually do that npm start and make sure it looks the way it's supposed to look at the beginning. In task 2, my basic advice is just to follow the instructions closely because it's very straightforward, but do a reality check and make sure that the text from the header and the instructions actually do appear in the browser. For task 3, which is where you change the app component, you can, again, change this to orbit types instead of display sats for that array that actually holds low, medium, and high. I recommend this highly. And then make sure you're changing it both for steps 4 and 6 in part of that task. In step 5, again, they use this term callback. A callback is actually a function passed to another function. So new sat display is actually just the parameter that's part of that callback. So if that helps clear that up for you, that's what they're referring to. For task 4, if you have changed display sats to orbit types for the array of orbit types, make sure you also change it in the prop for the buttons. And then while you're mapping over that array of orbit types, use the index and set a key on each button. And then your placeholder button will be replaced by 3 buttons. The last button still needs to have a click event handler. So just a reminder of all of those things. You can test your buttons with console log statements if you want to. The only thing is you would have to have multiple lines inside your handler functions. If you did them inline on the buttons, that may mean you want to define them separately and then just reference them. So that's up to you. But if you really want to make sure they're working, you could just restructure them a little bit and add that if you want to. Some common things for task 5 would be, just read the instructions carefully. So this is where you're creating the table and they do map it out for you. So when you're going over the array of satellites to create the JSX for each row in the table, again, I recommend that you use the satellites ID property for the key attribute rather than using the index that's provided by the map function. And then also do a reality check and make sure that all those buttons are working. Click on them and make sure the satellites are displaying that you expect. The task 6, the styling is optional, but you'll want to make sure that in the CSS file, it actually says header instead of H1, both at the top and the bottom, and then everything should look the same way it did in the introduction to the assignment. Make sure all 9 tests are passing, and then you'll be good to go. So just as a reminder, with graded assignments, you can share your code only with your IAs. You can't share it with your classmates or any developers you might know in your life. That's part of the academic integrity policy at LaunchCode. If you get stuck, there are a number of things you can do. Try to debug on your own because you really do learn a lot this way. Recheck the instructions, go to your chapters, lecture materials, look at different code examples that'll help you understand the concepts a little bit better or the syntax. Walk away for a little bit if you need to. Clear your head, then come back and try again. Attend office hours with your IAs for one-on-one help if you still are really stuck. And then, of course, just stay in regular communication with your IAs while you're working on this. They are there to help you. They want you to get to the finish line. And if they don't hear from you and you haven't turned anything in or asked for help, they might be concerned about you. So just stay in communication. That's pretty much all I've got. So I hope this has been helpful, and I will see you in Unit 2.